Hi there. You know how difficult it is when you go to your company and let's say you, on a daily basis, as part of your job role, you are going to have access to 20 different applications every day. And for these 20 different applications, you have different set of credentials. And when you have different credentials for all these applications based on their different security policies, it becomes very difficult to maintain. And normally people then try to skip the entire security and they start writing their passwords and paste it on their desk, which is a big security vulnerability. So how do we resolve this particular problem? That is where the single sign-on concept has come in. So a end user is going to authenticate to the central system at once. And then every time he is going to access any application, any system, their own, this single sign-on will make sure that the user is not typing in the username password every time. It does not mean that the authentication is not happening. Authentication is anyways happening, but this is happening transparent of the user. User don't need to type in different username and password. Only one single username password and you can use it. When you need to have only one single password, you can make sure you make it strong and you keep it secure as well. Right? That's a great benefit. Instead of maintaining 20 different passwords, you can maintain one complex username password, right? That is easy. However, this single sign-on has its own disadvantage as well. And one of the biggest disadvantage is if the single sign-on system is down, then all the other applications in the environment you will not be able to access. What is the solution? Solution is to make sure that the central system which you have, you make it so redundant that is never down. Right? So just don't, you can say, ignore single sign-on because it can be a single point of failure. You need to have additional controls to make sure, otherwise single sign-on is the way to go. It makes your life easy. It can also make sure that you implement MFA in the right way, and it can make the entire environment very, very secure. That is why companies, they go with SSO. However, configuring SSO is not an easy task. It takes little bit of expertise in there. But with all different cloud services coming, vendors coming with simple solutions, slowly this is becoming one more easy step for everyone to follow. Now, when it comes to SSO, let's get into this and try to understand how does it works. So one of the things which we need to understand is SAML. One of the oldest way of SSO implementation is SAML. SAML 2.0 is the latest one. So let's say you are here and you want to actually gain a particular service from here. This is the service provider. And then when you reaches out to the service provider with the request for access, what will happen is the service provider will actually generate a SAML request. It will generate a SAML request. It will send it back to the browser. And it will ask this to be get authenticated from the identity provider. Let's say this is your Active Directory. Let's say in this particular case, your Active Directory is your identity provider. So an identity provider is the central authentication and access control system what you have. Let's say this service provider has sent you this particular request. Your browser, irrespective, like it is transparent of you, your browser will take up this same request, will send it to the Active Directory. That means your identity provider. Your identity provider will authenticate you. It may ask you to provide username and password if you are doing it for the first time. If you are not doing it for the first time, it will automatically be done. And then once that is done, there will be a token which will be assigned by the identity provider, and it goes as an assertion. Now, what is an assertion? An assertion is a you can say a fact or a data element which goes back once the authentication is done, and then your browser receives it the same as it is. Your browser will relay to the service provider. Service provider will see if this particular response is digitally signed by your identity provider. If the digital signature is matching, the particular service provider will start giving you access. It will start giving you the services. Right? Simple thing. Let me explain you this entire thing one more time in a more simplistic format so that it is engraved in your mind. In the entire SAML, the current version of SAML is SAML 2.0. There are three major players in this. One is the user who need to access certain service. There is a service. Let's say you want to access payroll here, payroll application here. And when you access the payroll service, you request for it, the payroll service will generate a SAML request, and then it will pass it on to your browser. Your browser will in turn send it to the identity provider, which might be your Active Directory in the environment. Your Active Directory will authenticate with you if required. If you have already authenticated first time, then second time it may not ask you for authentication, like transparently it will happen. And then the request is then sent back to the token, the access token is sent to the browser. Your browser will send it back to the service provider, and service provider will start giving you access. Please understand, all this entire thing is happening transparently. All this is happening transparently. The user is not bothered. If user is getting bothered, he will only be bothered at this point for username and password if he has already not logged in on the system. Right? So this is how your entire SAML 2.0 works. Now, in your entire SAML, the SAML is what? Security Assertion Markup Language. Security Assertion Markup Language. That means entire thing is based on markup language. That means through XML is used for SAML, and assertion is nothing. In your entire XML, the data is kept in these kind of tags. When these tags carry on some kind of token or authentication related data, it is called as assertion. Right? Now in this, first, even before you get this, the entire thing possible, how this entire thing is made possible? Because before this, there has to be an enrollment process. A SAML enrollment process or SSO process which has to happen. So you need to maintain trust between this service provider and identity provider. Because when the system reply back with the token which it has received from the authentication system or maybe identity provider, the service provider is validating this. It means there is some exchange of digital certificate which happens here, because it has to validate the digital signature, right? So to do that, there is an enrollment process which takes place. So as you can see here, there is a level of trust which has been established between the two parties, right? That means your IDP, identity provider, and your service provider. It all happens in the XML format. There is an enrollment process which happens in the XML format. And what will happen is there will be digital signatures or digital certificates which will be exchanged. Then once a particular user access it, a user can access a particular service provider in two ways. First one, it is already authenticated with the IDP, identity provider, and then identity provider sends the request to the service provider. So this is called as IDP initiated. The other way can also be when the user actually reaches to the service provider, then service provider generates a particular SAML request and send it to the IDP. That is called as service provider initiated. An example of service provider initiated is this one, whatever we discussed in the last slide. So this is service provider initiated because that is where the request has been generated. Okay. So I hope you understood this thing. Then the entire exchange of the authentication data is happening on XML. That means is the HTML format by itself. So sometimes we are using a SAML SOAP protocol. Okay, that is called as binding. There are 4 different processes in your entire HTML, like put and then post, then there are 2 more, redirect and all of that, right? So if you are using a SOAP protocol for this, then all this will be called as your binding. Binding is nothing but the way you follow to actually exchange data between the 2 parties. So you can say in an IDP initiated, that is what the request is generated, the user agent is going to the IDP, and then IDP then give the request. It will generate a request here, and it will go to the user agent. User agent will reach to the service provider. Service provider will set up a session with it, and the entire thing will start. When it is service provider initiated, that means the user will reach out to the service provider directly. In this case, the user reach out to the IDP. In this case, the user will reach out to the service provider, and then service provider will give back the SAML request. It will take the SAML request, reach to the IDP. IDP will respond with the authentication, and then the user agent will pass it the same authentication request to service provider, and then the session will be established between the 2 parties. So in a IDP initiated, the first thing which is happening is the user is accessing the IDP. In service initiated or the service provider initiated, the user directly goes to the service, and then service asks it to take the token from the IDP, and that is how the entire thing will happen. And in the next session, we are going to understand what is Kerberos, because that is another form of SSO, a major protocol which is used in SSO, especially in Windows environment.